Okay, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are in the country. I'm Chuck Wexler from PERF, and uncharted territory. What a 3 months this has been. Probably the most challenging period for the country and for communities and for police departments across the country. So I'm talking to you from the PERF offices here in Washington, D.C. I got my staff. Everybody else has a mask on, by the way, but I thought it would be better not to have a mask. You can understand me, even with the Boston accent. So this is all brand new, this whole technology. I would have loved to have the PERF Town Hall meeting in person, but we can't do that. So we're going to make the best of it. We have 4 sessions today. We have responding to the COVID-19. We have demonstrations following the death of George Floyd. We have use of force, and we have defunding the police. So we'll be covering each of those areas, about a half an hour each. And if you want to ask a question, you click the chat icon in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. We will get that question. Tom Wilson is over here, who heads our management area. He'll get the question and we'll try to make it interactive. Now, to really make this a PERF Town Hall meeting, I have to do this, and you'll appreciate this. So, take off my jacket. This is usually where the microphone comes off. And roll up my sleeves. As you know, if I didn't do this, it wouldn't be an authentic PERF Town Hall meeting. I kind of feel like maybe Stephen Colbert, no audience, maybe a dog will come here or something, or kiss me in the face or something, I don't know what. But let's get right into it. The first session will be on responding to COVID-19. I have NYPD Commissioner Dermot Shea, Miami Chief George Colonia, and we're trying to get Jim Craig, who should be on the line from Detroit. So let's start off with this video first, and then we'll get right into it.
Under a fiery Florida sun, tonight the temperatures aren't the only numbers rising, so are COVID cases. Today, Miami announcing a pause in the next phase of reopening.
Now is not a time to let your guard down.
In the last week, the number of cases statewide has soared by 10,000. Florida's governor attributing the higher totals to more testing, but health officials are worried about the trend.
I think it's been a pretty rapid rise over the past, like I said, 10 days to 2 weeks. And so that has to be a concern on its own.
Concern also across the country, with at least 16 states showing a spike. In Texas, a record number of hospitalizations for COVID-19 and growing examples of people ignoring the rules. In New York, where cases have declined, the governor threatened businesses with cranking up restrictions after floods of people crowded Manhattan bars.
People are violating everything. Everything. No masks, no social distancing. You're violating the rules. What are you doing?
Similar calls for common sense in Nashville after images like this emerged from Kid Rock's honky tonk. And in Arizona, where hospitals have activated emergency plans, these bargoers in Scottsdale lined the block shoulder to shoulder. Back in Florida, several bars shutting down today for cleaning after reported COVID cases. Joaquin Chamizo is taking every possible precaution to stop the spread and save his business.
If you were told by the mayor that you had to shut down again, what would that mean to your business?
It'd be very difficult, to tell you the truth. It'd be devastating to shut down again.
States balancing an economic emergency with threats of a new COVID wave ready to crash. Sam Brock, NBC News, Miami.
Okay. Commissioner Dermot Shea. Commissioner, are you there? I cannot hear him. I cannot hear. Hold on.
Yep.
This is Dermot, can you hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Okay, can you understand my Boston accent?
Once you took your jacket off, I can understand you.
Hey, listen, what a 4-month period this has been for you? I mean, what has this been like?
Well, you mentioned the force, the George Floyd, the Corona. To me, it's not four separate things. It's been one continuous 4-month period, Chuck. It's been difficult. Obviously, I think that's an understatement. I think the men and women of the department have risen to the challenge. It's been a very difficult time. We've lost a lot of members. Really, I'm not oblivious to the fact that New York, I think, is a little unique here. We've certainly been hit harder. We're probably the last to come back from the COVID. It's just been an extremely difficult time, a tight wire act the whole way in terms of getting your members through this on the health side, getting New Yorkers through this, and now with the protests and everything else, it's I'd be lying if I didn't say it hasn't been a challenge.
I don't think that there is a police department in the country that has been hit personally as hard as the NYPD. How many members of the NYPD family have you lost?
So the larger family, we've lost 45 members. That includes 6 auxiliary members, but we consider them an integral part, obviously. It's hit the civilian side much harder than the uniform side. They tend to be older. Some health issues involved there, certainly, Chuck, but 45 is a large number. And then when you start looking out at the expanded family, there isn't too many people that haven't had somebody that they know or love that has been felt by this. And we still have 4 members that are in pretty tough shape in the hospital.
But your people have stepped up, they've managed, and they've overcome this. How do you think about this going forward? I'm going to read you something from the Washington Post. So the headline in the Washington Post is, "Police reform hits a partisan wall on the Hill." But I don't think that's the most significant story on the front page of the Washington Post. I'm going to read you something that's really gives a chill over you. Here's the middle part of it. It says, "China is moving rapidly to seal off its capital of 22 million residents by canceling flights and trains amid growing fears that a potential second wave of the novel coronavirus is gathering strength in Beijing and could spread to the rest of the country." So there's this story kind of buried here about, and we know that this started in China. I'm trying to get my head around psychologically, what that might mean should the numbers start to reverse in New York. How do you deal with that?
Well, it's tough. I could think back probably a month ago on a radio interview, and I said to the person answering the questions, New York feels like the Kentucky Derby. We're lined up at the starting gate and ready to burst out of the gate. We've felt like that for months now, and we haven't been able. The race hasn't started. Between businesses, between schools, upended. The recent protests, Chuck, have just been another dynamic where we still have overwhelmingly businesses closed. You can't go to the park and shoot a hoop if you're a kid, but we have 10,000 people in the street, and it's just, everyone is tired. The entire city feels different. It feels like the soul's been ripped out of it, and that's just combining everything together here. We are ready to go, but then you talk about that's not lost on us either. And at the same time that we're ready to go and get this city back moving, personally, professionally on this job, as well as the whole city, we're also concerned. So you still see people wearing masks. You still see internally here, we're doing the thermometer screenings. We're doing the testing. I mean, thankfully, our sick rate has really been very good for the last couple months now. But it's obviously a concern.
If you should have to, if the governor comes out and he says we have to go back a step, will there be lessons that you learned from this first period that will change how you manage should you have to do that in the second period? Will there be any lessons you took away from going through the first 3 months?
Yeah, and I think regardless if we go backwards, I think there's changes that and definitely lessons learned. So when you talk about how we operate our workplaces, we do much more remotely now. Whether you're talking about internal executive meetings that are done via video and teleconference, whether you talk about crime strategy meetings, all of that, Chuck, has changed. When you talk about the equipment that's worn, when you talk about the tracing that we've done, if a cop does get sick, people still get sick. People still break bones. You're not going into the doctor's office internally here. Everything is done via video. So between temperature screenings, between the testing that we've done, between all the remote and spacing people out, we think we're in a much better position, but we're also, I would categorize it as cautiously optimistic at this point.
Okay.
The X factor is the trains, obviously the trains, and as the city gets really ramped up and you get 8 million people, that's a lot of close contact sports, if you will.
Okay, let me bring George Colonia in from Miami. Chief, are you there?
I am, Chuck. I'm here.
Okay. First of all, I'm going to ask you how you're feeling. You're one of the chiefs in the country that actually you tested positive. I was texting back and forth with you, and how do you feel? How are you feeling now?
Chuck, I feel great. Thankfully, I had symptoms for just a few days. Some of my fellow chiefs that were also ill would text me, reach out, let me know what to expect, which was quite nice. The anxiety was the worst part, not knowing what was going to happen because you're COVID positive. That was the worst part of it. But thankfully, I feel great. I've been working for a while now and everything's well.
When I watched how you handled, you were like a textbook case. You were messaging out to your troops. You were taking temperature. You were doing all sorts of things. You were working with the health department. You knew the locations of where people had tested positive. Any lessons that you want to share? And by the way, unfortunately, what I'm reading about Miami is the numbers are starting to go up in Miami too, right? So give me some thoughts about that.
So first, the lessons. I think, we had the strategy here very early on in early March. We started with the screenings at every station, wearing the bands to make sure that people knew, we still got to put them on now. Every day you get screened, that you're symptom free, that you don't have a temperature. You get the band so everyone knows you've been checked. Sending a lot of people to home to work remotely has worked out great for us, and we're going to keep some of that, by the way. So all of our records unit working from home has been effective. They're actually more efficient. Now we get that space that they were occupying, and we get to reappropriate that. That's thousands of square feet of office space that we didn't have before that we can use now. But I think the biggest lesson for us was being aggressive and sending our own officers home instead of waiting for someone to have symptoms. Chuck, what we did when we get the information back from the Department of Health of these COVID positive locations, we would go back 14 days. And if any officer responded to any of those locations, symptoms or not, we would quarantine them. And a lot of people worried that we were sending a lot of the officers home without even showing any symptoms. But the idea was, man, if we're very proactive and we police ourselves in this way and we don't have officers coming in that are asymptomatic and start making people sick, maybe we'll be ahead of the curve. And thankfully, that's what the data showed us, that we did stay ahead of the curve. Our rate of infection within the department was less than in the city, in the county, in the state, even though we have all these officers out working. And I think it's because we were so aggressive in actually sending people home and quarantining and getting them tested as quickly as we could.
So we have Jim Craig on. Is Jim Craig on here too? Let me get Jim Craig on here. Okay.
How you doing,
my good friend Jim.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey.
All right.
Okay. See, these two individuals know each other. for all sorts of reasons,
Yes.
but Jim Craig also was tested positive. And
Yes.
Detroit was really, really hit hard. Detroit was a city like New York, and that you tested positive, and the head of your homicide unit, he died.
Yes, he did.
Sad to hear about that. And then you had just a bunch of your officers came down with it. So, some perspective on that. What was it like going through that? And then what are some of the lessons that Detroit learned?
You know, I'll tell you, Chuck, just like my friend George out there, we had similar experiences. Certainly, I fought not to go to the hospital. Here in Detroit, certainly, we have a significant African American population, and we know data show that 3 to 4 times more likely African Americans would contract it and or die from it. And then you break it down to the age group. Certainly, that was the age group I fell into. So I had some very deep concerns, but I fought it. I fought it hard. Had a lot of support. At one point in our department, we had 650 quarantined. 650. And I remember getting a call from my friend Charlie Beck, who was the interim chief out in Chicago. And he called and said, "What's going on in Detroit?" He said, "You're going to quarantine the entire police department before it's over." But it was really about, saving lives. Certainly our officers, as you indicated, our homicide commanding officer passed, a communications dispatcher passed. So it was a difficult time in the Detroit Police Department, but just not in the police department, the city. At one point, we were ranked 3rd in the country in terms of deaths. So it was very serious. And the thing we needed to do is act swiftly. When I look back, if we could have done anything differently, because this was a disease that we just didn't know a lot about, we didn't start seeing changes until 2 things. The number of folks that we quarantined, but also the fact that we made it mandatory that our officers wear the PPEs in the field. Any contact around the station, because definitively we knew that we were infecting each other. It wasn't so much our contacts in the field, we were infecting each other. And so, when we started to decline, so by way of example, Chuck, I mean, even as of today, we have a total of 14 officers or 14 sworn and civilian members of this department quarantine, which compared to, late March, 650. Now, when you look at total positive tests, we're sitting at about, as of today, about 325. And so that's still a significant number, and certainly the 2 that died. But I guess the number one question that Detroiters wanted to know, when you're talking about 650, how did you continue to provide services? So we anticipated as the infection started to rapidly increase, we knew early on, and by this time I'm infected. So I'm at home saying we got to shut down our support units, move them back into response units and patrol. We did that, and fortunately we didn't miss a beat. And I think the other thing that really helped us, we were one of the first cities to get the rapid testing. So we were able to get in, rapid tests, and if we determined that a member didn't have it, we could put them back in the field. And so those things work. Really, the PPEs, the rapid testing, our early response of quarantine, all of those factors mattered, and we didn't miss a beat. And as you know now, Chuck, we left COVID and went right into protests that became violent.
Let's talk about that too. Let's see if I can bring the 3 of you in. I want to have that discussion as it relates to. There's an intersection here between COVID and the demonstration factor, in which if you watched the images across the country, very often you'd see police officers right on top of the demonstrators. Dermot, in New York, there's this famous scene of Terry Monahan. He's there on top of the demonstrators. He's trying everything he can to de-escalate a situation. He doesn't have his mask on. I mean, he's on top of them. He's hugging people. I mean, this was a very risky operation at this point. And it's almost like the country forgot we have the worst pandemic in 100 years. What was your impression of like the safety factor, Dermot?
Yeah, I think you summarized it there, Chuck. We had worked for probably a couple months, changing the way we think every day, putting safeguards in place, like Jim mentions, the protective equipment. I would add in just even how we patrol every day. No more than 2 people ever in a car, things of that nature. When the protests started, out of necessity, those things went out the window. So just moving large amounts of cops around, mobilizing, we'd have 8 people in a van in close quarters. I mean, we knew that it was adding to the risk for sure. And now you're in close, not only are you in close proximity with people, I mean, those, as Jim said, in Detroit, New York was the same. Many of these protests were extremely violent from the beginning. And, you know, you're in close contact with people. You're literally sometimes fighting with people. And, you know, it was a challenge. And we're watching the sick rate extremely close. Any new cases, were they assigned to the protests? Thankfully, at this point, the answer is no. But it's a bit of a waiting game as well to see if, you know, we're about 2 weeks past now the beginning of those protests and thousands of people. And hopefully maybe that's another good thing that comes out of these protests where we learn that, you know, we can operate a little more freely and differently in New York.
And George, and then Jim, any other comments before I take some questions about that intersection between the pandemic and demonstrations and how you had to navigate that? Go ahead, George.
Yeah, so really quick, we got to a point here, Chuck, where we were very excited about the fact that we had 0 people that were ill, 0 officers, civilians that were quarantined. We were excited about that. That didn't last very long. After the protests started to happen, we have had people now that have come back positive, and then some more, and then some more, and people that were quarantining. So there's definitely a direct correlation. These were people that were out in the field, part of response platoons interacting with protesters that have come back positive. So there's certainly a connection. As Shay and Jim know, you know, when you have these kind of protests, anything that's going on outside where the officers all of a sudden come together in a way that they typically don't. So there's a certain bonding that's happening, that brotherhood, sisterhood spirit kind of clicks in again, and you kind of want to be up on each other as well. And it's difficult to control. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of the negative results of that.
Okay, Jim, and then we'll see if we have any questions here, Tom, right? Jim, what was that like with the demonstrations and the safety factor for you in Detroit?
You know, I got to tell you, Chuck, our experience is a little bit different than George. I was deeply concerned that we were going to see our infection rate go through the roof. I mean, given where we came from, it has steadily declined. And I'll tell you, I'll be candid, you know, during the heat of the protest, given all the equipment that the officers were wearing, the helmets, the shields, we didn't enforce and push hard on the donning of the PPE. You know, we were just happy the officers were coming to work. We're talking about 8 days without a day off, 9, 10 days on the protest line. And even to this date, we just have not seen an increase in the infection rate. And so I'm still sitting on the edge, though, because it still might start creeping up. Now, I had heard reports that there were some protesters, and many of which were not donning PPEs. Some of them got very ill. But, you know, the scientists are now saying if you're outdoors, that you have a greater chance of not contracting. But then when you infuse gas, because we deployed some gas the first 3 nights, pretty substantially, that can have an effect on how the virus spreads. So far we're doing well.
You know, I want to get Dermot Shea, and then I want to do some questions. This doesn't relate to COVID, but I know I'm gonna lose you, Dermot. But you did some things in the last few days, all in response to the whole trust issue. You did something in terms of your anti-crime unit, and you did something in terms of body-worn cameras. Give us a little sense. What were you thinking? I know this doesn't relate to COVID, but I think that's a big national issue. What were you thinking in terms of those movements you made?
With the body cameras, Chuck, what are you referring to? Some announcements recently?
In terms of releasing the video, you know, making it known when you're going to release it and so forth, and then in terms of the anti-crime unit.
Chuck, so first with the body-worn cameras, there's been some announcements lately. A lot of people, you know, are announcing reforms, but the truth of the matter here is that we like many other police departments across the country, as we integrated body-worn cameras, we came up with a pretty robust body-worn camera policy of types of incidents, critical incidents we call it, that we release within 30 days. Some of the announcements that were made this week really were in line with that body-worn camera policy that we already had. I think it's more about reassuring the public that change has been done. Where we've probably been behind the eight ball is we have reformed so much, like many others, in the last 4 to 6 years, and the public doesn't realize it. And we still have more to do, but it's about telling the public how much we, across this country, in leadership positions, have been looking to change. So that was the body-worn cameras. Very different story with the anti-crime. That's something that I've been looking at for well over a year in terms how we deploy them, how they go out the door every day, what uniform they're wearing. This environment brought it to a head. Chuck, I would describe it, I'm getting heat from both sides here. You know, I'm getting a lot of support. I'm getting a lot of criticism. Here is what I would boil it down to, and me and you have had this conversation before. If you look at the police and talk about crime and only talk about the police, you're missing the boat, I believe. And you have to have a larger discussion about laws, district attorneys, parole, probation, incarceration rates. And we're in an environment right now in New York State and certainly New York City where it is extremely difficult to get career criminals behind bars. And I think that is the issue more than anything else. The answer to rising crime, Chuck, and increases in shootings, which we're seeing before this decision was made, cannot be send out small groups of cops and tell them to stop more and more people. That's particularly going to be in African-American neighborhoods. It cannot be the answer. We need more precision and less stops, less brute force, and we can get to where we want to be. We can build trust. We can build bonds with the communities, but we can also have safe streets. But if in this current environment, I think, Chuck, something has to give. Where we have the lowest incarceration we've seen in decades, we're putting more and more people out on the street without a plan, and we're expecting the police to hold crime down. And so it was done for the community. It was also done for my police officers, because we cannot put our police officers out there and expect them to stop people over and over and then turn our backs on them when we know what exactly is going to happen.
Okay, thank you. That's great. Tom Wilson, do you have any questions from the people?
So one that we've gotten several in are any operational changes that the chiefs made during COVID-19 that they expect will be permanent.
So, George, you want to take that question? Did you hear that?
I did, and yeah, I briefly mentioned it before. You know, one of the changes, we divided our communications to make sure that there was a decreased chance of spreading COVID among our dispatchers and call takers. So we put them in 2 different sites, and we like the idea of that. But really the biggest thing, the amount of people working remotely from home, where we discovered that it's far more efficient working at home than it is in the office. We got so much more back in terms of work product, specifically, like I mentioned, our records bureau, that it's something that we're just going to keep, because we're getting a better work product and more efficiency from working from home, Why would we bring someone in, occupying workspace, occupying parking, et cetera? And wherever we have administrative positions, as we look at this a little further, where we have the ability to do that, we're going to implement that and we're going to keep going forward. So that's been one of the kind of the side benefits of all of this, that it forced us to be more efficient in a way that we didn't anticipate, but thankfully it's worked out for us.
I remember, Jim Craig, I remember you telling me, because you had one of your dispatchers got sick, you had to actually, if I'm not mistaken, you had to close down a dispatch center and open up another one. Am I correct?
You're absolutely correct, Chuck. We were fortunate. When we built our new state-of-the-art communications center, one of the things that I absolutely wanted to have in place was to maintain the original center, so that in the event of an attack, or who would have thought COVID, that we would have to turn a switch on the center, and we ended up doing that. And so we moved into our original center while we sterilized and gave the place a thorough cleaning after the death of that dispatcher. But when I look back on that decision,
Wait, did we just lose Detroit? I think James.
Hey,
James,
Chuck. Chuck,
yes, sir. Go ahead, Dermot. Go ahead, Dermot.
Chuck, before I leave, if I could, because I just got a text here from Tom. Tom would like you to consider if he could work remotely from his boat. So I figured I obligated to mention that to you.
Okay. Yeah, every time I go out on his boat with him, he doesn't catch any fish. So I think it's, I think we're on a fishing expedition there, Mr. Commissioner. I'm losing. Okay. All right, gentlemen. I'm going to have to end it here. Thank you all very much. We got to go on to the next crew. Thank you for all you're doing. Appreciate it. We're going to switch gears here now. We're going to switch gears now. Oh, my guy's telling me to fix my tie. Hold on. Where's my wife when I need her? Hold on. Okay, it's just going to have to be like that. All right. The second panel. Okay, let's, as they say in Hollywood, let's go to the videotape here. Let's show them the video here, okay?
Overnight, nationwide unrest.
We don't want to loot. That's not what we out here for. But we do want justice and we want equality. And if we don't get that, we're going to be out here.
Large crowds of demonstrators in multiple cities getting more violent following the death of George Floyd. In Washington, D.C., protesters setting a large fire just blocks from the White House, shouting, "You are the threat," to police in riot gear. In Boston, businesses damaged and fires set as protesters clash with police. In New York City, many of the demonstrations peaceful. But tensions flaring in Brooklyn overnight, this crowd dispersing near the Barclays Center. And over the weekend, this woman seen in a video obtained by the Daily Mail now facing federal charges after allegedly throwing a Molotov cocktail at a police car.
The message is we're peaceful, and I think there are instigators that are erupting in this violence, and it reflects on black people.
Curfews in effect in more than 20 cities, including Philadelphia, where stores were ransacked and police officers hit with bricks. In New Jersey, looting seen in Trenton and Atlantic City. Protesters in Atlanta constructing a fence to use as a barricade.
And it looks like they're trying to light a fire in the middle of that street right there where they just put up the barricade. They're trying to light that fire with fireworks.
And more chaos in Minneapolis, where Officer Derek Chauvin is now charged with murder after he was seen with his knee on Floyd's neck moments before his death on Memorial Day. This dramatic scene playing out at a peaceful gathering Sunday. People marching on a highway bridge. A tanker truck barrels toward the crowd.
A semi, there was nobody because they'd stopped traffic. And a semi truck, it must have been going at least 50, 60 miles per hour, just ran through all those people.
The crowd moving in after the truck stops, pulling the driver from the car.
Oh, this is bad.
Deputies dispersed the crowd with pepper spray. That driver now under arrest after getting treated at the hospital, accused of trying to incite the crowd.
Okay, so this section is about demonstrations following the death of George Floyd. we've got three guests. We've got the Assistant Chief, Jeff Carroll from Metropolitan Police Department in Washington. We have Commissioner Mike Harrison from Baltimore. And we have from Louisville Metro Interim Chief Robert Schroeder. So let me start with you, Jeff, from DC. First of all, how long have you been with the Metropolitan Police Department?
Sure, Chuck. Well, first off, I want to thank you for inviting us to the town hall this afternoon. I've been here at the Metropolitan Police Department for over 18 years, and I've been in charge of our Homeland Security Bureau for over 3 years. Prior to that, I was the commander of our Special Operations Division, which oversees all of our protests, demonstrations, and all of our special events, including the inauguration.
So let me ask for some perspective here. First of all, Metropolitan Police Department in Washington probably handles more demonstrations per day than maybe you'd have to get New York as well on some, but you pretty much doing demonstrations is nothing new. Put in context how these demonstrations were the last couple of weeks compared to what you've seen before. How would you characterize them?
Sure, Chuck. So as you mentioned, here in Washington, D.C., we have demonstrations, multiple demonstrations on a daily basis. 99% of those demonstrations are generally peaceful, with the demonstrators voicing their First Amendment rights for whatever their cause or concern is. With Mr. Floyd's demonstrations, initially, they began peaceful like most of our demonstrations do. But then we saw on May 20th, really in the evening time, one of the peaceful demonstrations make its way down to the White House, where it began to heat up. And then as nighttime erupted, the demonstrators began to throw items, to fight with the police officers. And really, those demonstrations focused around the White House, especially with the beginning days. And then they started to spread out across the city. And these are not peaceful demonstrators that would come out normally. These are people that were there specifically to incite violence, to destroy our community here inside Washington, D.C., and to loot items from the establishments throughout the downtown area and across the city.
I mean, it sounded like what happened in Washington happened in a lot of other cities. You'd have pretty much peaceful demonstrators during the day and into the night, and then something would happen as in the later hours. Were you able to get your hands on what was happening? What was the transition from the peaceful demonstrators to the ones who were wreaking havoc? What happened, do you think, that, because that happened, we'll hear from other cities too, but what do you think, what was your assessment of that?
Sure. So as nighttime kind of came upon the city, I think, as you mentioned, a lot of the peaceful folks started to go home. There still were some peaceful demonstrators that were here in the city, and the agitators that you'll hear, I'm sure, from other locations across the country, they really use those peaceful individuals that would be in the front of the police lines, who may be vocal against the police, but weren't actually causing harm or throwing items, kind of as a shield. And then you have individuals that are behind those folks that are throwing objects, shooting fireworks, improvised explosive devices, throwing water bottles, glass bottles, rocks, bricks towards the officers. So really, it became a tactic that was used to really attack the officers and using those other folks as human shields. And then as the night kind of went on, I mean, things continued to escalate. And really, I think you had some people that they saw what was going on across the nation. They saw some of the other looting that was going on. And those protests, they broke away from our downtown core, where the White House is located at, and they started to spread it to our commercial establishments. And really, it became an opportunity for individuals involved in criminal activity to destroy property and attempt to get inside some of those locations over several nights. I mean, they burned vehicles, they set buildings on fires, while the men and women of the Metropolitan Police Departments, were out there putting the fires out, working with the fire department to get the fire department in there and trying to restore order to the city.
When people look at the demonstrations, the way you all start out, correct me if I'm wrong, is you start out sort of with a soft approach, with the regular uniforms and so forth. And then people would look at the videos and they would see police that appeared to be in, heavier gear. Why did you do that? How did you do that? And what was your objective? I mean, do you worry about property damage? Do you worry about your officers? What are you thinking? It seems like a really chaotic period of time to have to navigate.
Sure. So we have very strict regulations here in the city. We can't put on hard gear, helmets, or personal protective equipment to protect officers unless there's an actual threat of danger. So individuals that begin throwing items, things of that nature. Obviously, here in the city, there are multiple police forces. So a lot of times people initially think of the Metropolitan Police Department But there are other agencies, especially in the downtown area, the United States Park Police, Uniform Division Secret Service, as well as other law enforcement agencies. So for the MPD policies, we don't put on any hard gear until there's actually a need for that. Obviously, we've learned through our experiences over the year, we want to start out with the lowest level possible to keep the situation under control. However, if it does escalate, we have to make sure that our officers are protected and they have the appropriate equipment. The first night when things started to become violent, they really, as I mentioned, focused at the White House, and the Uniform Division of the Secret Service really held that line. And initially, their personnel were not wearing helmets. And there was individuals that were throwing bricks and rocks and injuring their officers. And it's something that all the law enforcement agencies in the city, the Metropolitan Police Department, as well as Secret Service and Park Police, they had officers that were injured due to these types of activities. So once we see that, we instruct our officers to put on their protective equipment to keep them as safe as possible.
Yeah, because I think a lot of people look at it and they look at it and they wonder, why were the police dressed, with their heavy gear? From a commander's perspective, you're seeing your officers getting hurt, and they're coming to you and saying, "Hey, boss, our guys are getting hurt. I think we need to get them the equipment." It's not really what you want to do, but it's what the circumstances are pushing you toward, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to safeguard your personnel and our officers. I mean, we ask a lot for them to stand on the line to deal with, a lot of the verbal attacks. That's one thing. But when you have actual objects being thrown at the officers that can hurt them, we did have multiple officers that were injured. We had one officer whose leg was actually broken, and he had to have emergency surgery when he was struck by a large object during a movement. One of the nights when there was fires that were set in our downtown area, a large building fire, and we had to clear out the area so the fire department can get in. So we had some officers that did have some serious injuries out there. And then when things de-escalate, we also remove the helmets. So, when things de-escalate after, a couple of days of violent activity, but now things have returned to our normal peaceful demonstrations. They continue to this day. We have multiple demonstrations scheduled for today as well as through the weekend. In those instances, the officers, they'll be wearing their regular uniforms. They won't be wearing any riot gear unless there's an instance or something that happens that requires them to wear protective equipment.
All right, thank you. Let's go on to Commissioner Mike Harrison in Baltimore. How are you, Commissioner?
Doing well, Chuck. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you. I can hear you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of your town hall.
So, you came in, you're the new police commissioner. I guess you're not so new anymore, right? You got probably some battle scars.
About a year and a half, yes.
Okay, so anyhow, you come from New Orleans, you come into Baltimore. Obviously, the Freddie Gray case and disturbances had to be on your mind. But something happened, something didn't happen in Baltimore, which people were worried about. What was your thinking?
Well, the thinking was to make sure we were prepared, but like you heard from Washington, D.C., we wanted to make sure that we were, number one, meeting with organizers and speaking with as many leaders in the community, whether they're faith leaders, activist leaders, civic leaders, elected officials, to make sure we had people on the ground to help self-police the crowds so that we could have peaceful protests. That happened. And so we, like Washington, went out with a soft look in regular uniform, and we maintained that until the 8:30 to 9 o'clock hour at night. And when we see protesters begin to leave, there were about 100, 150 maybe stayed on. That's when things began to be thrown at the officers. And then we had a plan to swap out those officers with about a 1 to 2 minute response, because we had a second tier of officers who were dressed in protective equipment began to take over that line and hold that line. And we used a barricade design around police headquarters and around City Hall that kept protesters on the opposite side of the barricades. So they were not always in close proximity to our officers. However, when they were, the officers exercised great restraint. Our consent decree has in it that lessons learned from Freddie Gray. We had to, number one, equip all of our officers with the necessary protective equipment that we did not have in 2015, and then train everybody in how to handle these civil disturbances and demonstrations according to best practices. And so everyone has been trained and equipped. And what you saw was a very different kind of protest. Number one, the police exercised great restraint, great tolerance, acceptance, empathy, and held the line, even when people were throwing things at us. And we were able to then swap out to put people out there so we can protect our officers from harm. And number two, we utilize community members and leaders in the community to help keep the crowds calm. And what we saw was people from Baltimore did not let agitators step out of line. The first night we had a little bit of it and a few broken windows as young people went around late at night beyond midnight, broke a few windows. But after that, people in the crowds really self-policed the crowds. And the people of Baltimore did not want to see their city burn. And so they helped keep much of what we saw happening around the country from happening in Baltimore. It was really a beautiful thing to see community members helping the police to keep it calm. We were very fortunate and did not experience any of what we saw happening around the country, and our protests now continue to go on every day, but they're peaceful. Officers are in regular plain uniforms and are engaging. And then we also went out to a large degree during daylight hours to be among the members protesting, just to show that we understand what it is they're asking for. We are in the third year of this consent decree, so we're 3 years into what people are demanding. And so we're demonstrating that here. We've seen a very different Baltimore Police Department, but a very different Baltimore community this time around.
It seems to me what was very significant was what you did before the demonstration in terms of what the community aspect of that. Talk a little bit about that, because it seems like, someone told me, you make friends before you need them. It sounds like, what did you do before with the community? That seems like a very strategic decision.
There were a number of faith leaders and pastors here in Baltimore that reached out to me, and there were a number who I personally contacted to ask to come down and help, and they did. There were a number of community activists and community leaders from civic and different types of activist groups here in the community who found their way and asked me to be a part of the team and found a way to help. The leader of our NAACP from Baltimore was on the front lines, as an observer, but helping to keep crowds calm. I was in constant contact with these individuals, not necessarily giving them marching orders, but allowing them to help us to keep the crowds calm. And to the extent that they could be on the front lines in the crowd or on the side of the barricades where the police were, they were all extremely instrumental in helping keep crowds calm. Even some of our young people, a number of rallies were led by young people. I went out and met with them. I marched with them. I took a knee with them. Those are the kind of things that our officers did, and we believe really kept Baltimore from seeing what we saw in 2015 and seeing what we've been seeing around the country now.
All right, thank you, Mike. Let's go to Louisville Chief Robert Schroeder. Chief, are you there?
I am. Good afternoon, Chuck.
All right, good afternoon, sir. So Louisville, let's face it, Louisville has really been challenged. You've got some difficult situations you've had to face. You lost your chief, and by the way, I like Steve Conrad. He's a good man, and I thought he'd done a good job. But boy, events overcome departments. We're seeing that, all around the country. That's another story about chiefs. But anyhow, so in the middle of all of this, he got fired, and you're the interim. What are some of the challenges you're facing in Louisville, and how are you thinking about it as you go forward?
I think it's a lot like you heard from the others. A lot of our challenges really start with the damage that's been done to our community relations. The department over the last several years has really been doing a lot of work to move that forward, and the incidents between our police shootings and some of the national police shootings have really put a dent in that, to the point where some of our long-term partners are questioning whether they actually want to be our partners right now. So that's a challenging aspect, and we have to rebuild those relationships. One of the tougher challenges I face, and I talk about it a lot, is coming into this, I have to rebuild not only the community's trust, but also the department's trust. We're really in a tough situation, kind of bringing the community and our police officers together. As far as the protests themselves go, much like you heard, ours started on May 28th, and it started off with a normal, peaceful protest. Louisville is known as a compassionate city, and we have a lot of protests over various issues, from immigration to whatever the topic of the day is, and they are almost always a peaceful protest. On May 28th, we started to see a different element of people come in, people who were obviously not from around here, who were coming in, bringing in weapons and implements we don't typically see in our protesters. They were essentially geared for battle. That continued throughout the day as we were watching them. And then once darkness fell, that's when things really got out of hand. We had 7 people shot, kind of in the epicenter of it, not police related. An unknown subject shot 7 people in it, and our officers had to respond in there and start to really bring in order. I think the other challenge you've seen is particularly the first, I'd say about 4 days, where we had a lot of outside influences. It was coordinated on a level we have never seen before. We had our officers split into different areas, and it was obviously clearly coordinated from some information and intelligence we got from some folks within the crowds that they were intentionally trying to divide our forces, which really spread us thin to the point where we had to ask for additional resources from the Kentucky State Police, the National Guard, to help us manage that.
You know, a lot of people, I'm sorry, a lot of people will look at some of these situations around the country and really haven't seen the munitions that were used, some places tear gas, some places pepper ball, and they don't understand. They say, why did the police do that? I don't know if that was done in Louisville, so I'm not going to assume it was, but in other cities, was that done in Louisville? If so, can you explain how you got to that point? Because let's face it, the last 20 years, really haven't seen that. We haven't also seen this level of violence either. So can you put this in context?
Yeah, in context, I've been here just shy of 23 years now, and I have never known us to use tear gas during a protest. Obviously a situation like a SWAT call out, it would be appropriate, but I've never seen it used for a civil disturbance. During the first 4 or 5 days, we did have to use it. We were seeing the shooting we talked about. It was certainly deployed during that time. We've had Molotov cocktails thrown at our officers. One of our officers was actually struck with one and momentarily caught on fire. We've had bottles of frozen water, rocks, bottles, urine, about everything you can imagine thrown at the officers. So we did deploy it. There was a significant community concern over that and almost an immediate visceral reaction from the community to the point where now that things are stable, we've been able to change the policy now to where tear gas is used only on my authority or on a person I designate to have that authority.
But let me ask you a question, because I mean it's a real, and you're going to know more about this than I am, but it's a real tactical question. So let me present the facts. You've got your officers there. Let's say hypothetically or real that rocks are being thrown, Molotov cocktails are being thrown. What are your options in those situations? And let's put this other variable in. Let's suppose property damage. People start breaking into stores and so forth. What do you think is expected? What does the public think on the one hand? What do you think from a policing standpoint? You're going to get criticized if you let the property go. If you try to go against the demonstrators and you have to use tear gas, you're going to be criticized. It seems like there's a real balancing act in terms of what the public expects and what you want to use tactically. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. There's certainly a balance you have to achieve there. But really, we have to focus on the sanctity of life. Property damage is bad. We don't want to see that. But really, we should only use those tactics when we're dealing with true life safety issues. And in some of the instances, we actually had to deploy tear gas. For instance, our officers got surrounded, and we had to use gas to basically make a way for our officers to have a route of safety, which, again, is something we haven't seen before. Certainly in the case of the shooting we had to use gas so our officers could get in to treat the wounded people from that shooting. And so it's okay. It really revolves around the sanctity of life.
Let me do this for a second. Let me play a video from Beloit, the Beloit police chief from Wisconsin. Let me just play. He asked this question of all of you. So if we can roll this video.
Good afternoon, Dave Zabalski, Beloit, Wisconsin PD. I think that in terms of the demonstrations as a result of the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis, a lot of us find ourselves between a rock and a hard place in terms of the enforcement of peaceful protests versus peaceful protests that reach a curfew time frame versus an entirely different situation where we're dealing with unlawful assemblies or looters and rioters. Many of these curfews are put in place by our elected officials, and at a certain point, law enforcement either has decided or been instructed to enforce that particular curfew on a crowd that, but for the curfew time, would otherwise be considered peaceful protesters. We don't have a lot of different tools to do that. Our only tools available are the OC, the pepper spray, pepper balls, 40 millimeter launchers, things of that nature that to most in the community in that situation seems rather extreme, and some may even argue excessive for the situation at hand. I think we really need to examine our tools, our tactics, and what our approach should be to situations like this going forward as law enforcement leaders.
So what the chief is, the question that he's really raising is if some cities had curfews and then you were expected to enforce the curfews, what happens if people don't want to leave? What kind of strategies should you use? And he said, should you use tear gas? Did any of your cities have this issue of curfews and having to enforce the curfews? Was it a good thing or was it a bad thing? And what are your strategies? Any of your cities have curfews?
Yeah, Chuck, this is Mike from Baltimore. So we did not have curfews. And I, along with a number of experts working on this, advised the mayor of what that meant to impose a curfew and our ability to enforce it, not just in the area where protests were, but everywhere in the city where it would be basically in effect. What we had was what's called a dispersal order given to us by our city attorney that gave us the legal right to shut down the area where the protest was happening because there were things happening that created hazards and went against public safety and made it where laws were being broken. And so we had the legal right to shut down that area and compel people to leave that area. Based on that dispersal order where we gave the ordinance from our helicopter and we announced it to everybody in the area over a 5-minute warning period, we began to just move our officers and protective equipment who had a line, move those people one step at a time further back. For those who did not want to leave and who stood their ground, there were a few arrests that were made, but we only made minimal arrests. And so after the first night, the second night, we made a handful of arrests. It really began to subside. But no, we did not use tear gas or smoke or pepper or the rubber bullets or any of those munitions to execute the dispersal order. We made a couple of arrests. The only time we had to use smoke, and we only used it one time, we never used tear gas, was on that first night. And so I would advocate not to use those munitions just to enforce a curfew or some type of dispersal order, only when there's harm to public safety and threats of harm to the officers who are out there holding that line. And it has to be real significant threats of bodily injury or worse.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to D.C. Jeff, what do you think about curfews? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what is your strategy from a policing standpoint?
Sure, Chuck. So we actually ran into this exact situation when the protest began. The first few nights when it was violence, we did not have a curfew. Then a curfew was established at 11 p.m. That curfew eventually moved to 7 p.m. and went back to 11 p.m. As far as a curfew for us, we did not use munitions to disperse the peaceful protesters. We did give warnings via communication devices, letting everyone know that there was a curfew in effect. The mayor and the chief went on TV, had press conferences. We also utilized the wireless emergency alert system, so everyone's cell phone on the entire city, they got that message so that way they could be aware that there was a curfew and to go home. But those individuals who did stay down in the downtown area, as long as they were peaceful, we did not arrest them. However, with that being said, we did have some groups of individuals that were engaged in some property destruction, and actually a group that set a police car on fire. That group of individuals, we did actually placed them under arrest for the curfew violation. We did have another group of curfew violators that were kind of the same situation. They're in an area where we had some downtown destruction of property and vehicle fires. They were arrested as well. So I believe that a curfew can be a useful tool in some situations. However, I don't believe that munitions should be used or any sort of a crowd control device merely because of groups outside. If that group is involved in criminal activity, they're no longer First Amendment demonstrators, rather they're committing criminal acts. But for general protesters, we're at the Metropolitan Police Department, we don't use OC spray and those types of items against them, and I wouldn't recommend using that just for merely a curfew violation unless there's more involved like that.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go to Tom Wilson and see if we got some questions.
Question from Mike Hill, Beverly Hills PD. How aggressively are agencies following up on the looting crimes?
Okay, so I'm going to go to Louisville here. Was there looting in Louisville?
There was a good bit of looting, particularly the first couple of nights, but as it progressed into the fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth night, not in the primary protest zone did we see looting, but we started to see a good amount of looting in our more suburban areas of the city. A pattern where you see groups come in with 5, 6, 10 cars and just start looting a particular area. We have been following up on those, but also in our emergency operations center, we had some of our federal partners in there, and they have also been helping us follow up on those, particularly in relation to some drugstores and other businesses of that type are looted. So we are following up as best we can on those.
Okay, Tom, other questions?
From Florida, what advice can the chiefs give to others regarding what steps they took to identify insurgents from outside of the community and deal with them proactively? What intelligence did they have about these groups beforehand, and how did that experience change their department strategies?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there is this assumption of that a lot of this damage is being done by outsiders versus people who live there. I don't even know what the evidence is. So far, it's kind of mixed, and a lot of the people who are arrested tend to be people who live in that area. But let's go with the person's question. If you have information that people are coming from outside the city, does that change your strategy? Mike Harrison, let's go to you.
I think it absolutely changes our strategy because we can either deploy plainclothes officers to do reconnaissance missions in the crowd to identify those bad actors and those very aggressive agitators, and to deploy other members of the community which worked very well in Baltimore, were able to identify bad actors. We had an outsider who was throwing bricks over the top of the crowd from the rear at police officers. And then we had community members who chased him down and grabbed him and dragged him to the police officers and turned him over. And so to the extent you can build a coalition of people to be in the crowd to help to identify those bad actors, that helped us from that night on, because that was televised. It was captured by our helicopter video, and then it was really televised. From that moment on, the community really stepped up and was very helpful, because they saw what could happen when they step up. But many of those people we were already working with and I was in constant contact with. So to the extent you can have the intelligence on the front end, you can deploy people to help either prevent it or deter it or apprehend people when they do it.
And just one more comment back to you, Mike Harrison. When you think about it, you can have, 10,000 people be completely peaceful, and you can have 25 people who are, focused on destruction, and it can totally mischaracterize the whole thing. Is that a fair assessment, Commissioner? Did I just lose him? Did I lose him?
We lost him.
Okay, we're going on. Sorry about that. We're going on to the next one. Thank you to that panel. Let's talk. Let's go to the third panel, and this one is on use of force. And we have three panelists. One is R.C. White, the former police chief of Denver and Louisville, and Greensboro and Washington. You can't keep a job, can you, Mr. White? Okay. And then we have Volusia County Sheriff Mike Chitwood. Mr. Chitwood, you there, sir?
Yes, sir, Chuck.
I'm surprised you're not on a bicycle giving this interview.
I got up just for you today.
All right. And then we have Professor Robin Engel, who is Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati. So let's start with R.C. White. You were the first outside police chief in the history of the Denver Police Department. And you had a mission that you were hired. Take some credit for this. Charlotte Lansinger did a great job in recruiting you and getting you to come to Denver. But your job was to reform the Denver Police Department. So how did that work out?
It worked out, but we certainly had our challenges. And it started by spending a lot of time inside the police department, talking to the troops, talking to the executive team, what they liked about the department, what they saw some of the challenges are. Spend equally as much time outside of the department, talking to the community and getting their perspective for what they were looking for, what worked and what didn't work. And from there, we kind of looked at every policy that we had. And when it came to the use of force policy specifically, I thought it was important that we change it, but equally as important that we get the community's output. So, which was extremely challenging, by the way. So what happened was that we had a lot of contacts. We made a lot of contacts, and you've always heard me talk about deposits and withdrawals. Made a lot of deposits in our community. The commanders had intimate relationships with the different organizations that they were responsible for. So we sent out our current policy and sent it out across the community, saying, "Hey, we're looking to upgrade this policy to be more progressive, more in line of the community's expectations, more consistent with PERF 30, and more consistent with 21st century policing." So we sent it out. We gave people a mechanism to give us feedback, and we attended a whole bunch of meetings. So after doing all of that, we generated a new policy. And after generating that new policy, we went out to the community again, sent out the policy also electronically to let people know, as a result of your feedback and as a result of where we are in our department today, and as a result of what we think is the best policy for this community, here's the policy that we're proposing. I thought that was going to be it. But I shouldn't say unfortunately, there were some individuals who was able to get the attention over my head and says that not only do we want a new policy, but we want to write the policy. This is the community now, specifically those that were our biggest critics. So I was encouraged to have a committee to sit down with us to go over the policy that we proposed and give the citizens an opportunity to literally put their input, their written input in it. So I made up a committee, a use of force committee that I understand is still in force. It had every organization that I felt that wanted some input, especially those that were very critical of us, as well as those that supported us. They were able to select a member to be part of the use of force committee. So we did that. 6 months later.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Keep going.
6 months later, after a whole lot of conversation, whole lot of sweat and tears, we finally came up with a use of force policy. And 6 days after that, I retired.
There was one particular incident. I think it was two young girls who died as a result of Denver police officer-involved shooting. And you looked at your policy and you had to have, you thought you had the right policy, didn't you?
Absolutely. I was feeling it. And when I say we looked at our policy, we had our planning unit look at policies across the country. Allegedly what allegedly were some of the best policies across the country. When we looked at those and we looked at ours, we felt pretty comfortable. But obviously that was a perception that we had, but it was not a perception of many in our community. So that absolutely generated a need to change that policy.
But there was something about that policy that many departments had that you thought it was state of the art. But what was, in terms of the shooting at cars, what was the part of that policy that made that you learned from that you changed?
Yeah, so the policy was pretty restrictive as it relates to officers' ability to shoot in cars. It pretty much all but prohibited them from doing that. And then we had this young lady who was actually 16 years old. She was driving a stolen car. She had her friends in the car with her. She apparently pinned a police officer in a corner where he felt that he didn't have any alternative but to shoot into the car to save his life. And his partner was behind him. He shot into the car, and the young lady expired. So as a result of that, our policy became much more restrictive. You and I had a lot of conversations as it relates to that. And one of the policies that we did look at the great debate with you was NYPD's policy that had been in place for years. After that, we changed the policy, but changing a policy dealing with police officers is not just good enough to say this is our new policy. You got to provide them training to go along with that policy. So we went across the country again, looking for experts as it relates to how you de-escalate those situations, how do you strategically not place yourself in harm's way. And after doing all of that, we came up with the policy that we have now. And from my recollection, I don't believe, and I've been gone for about a year and a half, and the new chief has been there since then, I don't believe we've had another incident where we, in fact, shot into a moving car.
So policy really matters. Okay, thank you, RC. Let's go to Mike Chitwood in Florida, Volusia County. How are you, Sheriff?
Pretty good, Chuck. How are you doing today?
Good. So you ran for sheriff. You ran for sheriff on a specific platform. What was that, Sheriff?
The platform was to modernize the sheriff's office, open up the windows, and bring the fresh air of change in particular, use of force and technology. As the police chief in Daytona Beach for 10.5 years, the Tampa Bay Times did a huge study of the use of force in Florida, and the Daytona Beach Police Department came out the least likely to use deadly force. And I thought, this is a no-brainer. We had been to Scotland. We talked about sanctity of human life. We talked about shooting into vehicles. We had all these wonderful changes. I become the sheriff, and the first 6 months of 2017, we shoot 6 people. And I reached out to you to come in and say, I got a culture here that everybody out in training is walking around with a shirt on that says confidence in the line of fire. When you walk into the training facility, above your head is confidence in the line of fire. And I think we're training in a warrior. There seems to be this warrior mentality here. And you guys did a phenomenal job for me. You came in, you issued a 90-page report that helped us revitalize our training, our culture, our policies and procedures. And we have seen a 60% reduction in use of force. We trained all of 2018 after you initialed the report. In 2019, we had 2 police shootings. In both shootings, the bad guy opened fire on us. In one of those cases, a deputy was hit in the head. Thank God he survived and thrived. Use of force is down 60%. The union criticized us, Chuck, as you know, that you're going to get cops hurt. Well, in 2019, assaults on police dropped by over 50%, which went back to de-escalation, training, concentrating, following the policy has been good measure for us.
You know, you're a tough cop from Philadelphia. John Timoney said, he never would want to have you following him, trying to get him. He said you were one of the best cops. There's a culture out there, Mike, right? There's how do you change culture? How do you get people to believe in what you're talking about? The thinking about, what you're talking about is soft. You're going to get cops killed. How do you change culture?
As the leader of the organizations, we all know that our time is short, and we have to use our energies to channel, number one, community support. The union represents 200 of my 400 deputies. As the sheriff, I represent 550,000 people in this county. So my responsibility is to make sure that this organization moves forward, find the informal leaders, get them involved, get the supervisors involved, and hammer home what we're doing. And now here we are, 6 months into 2020, and you're releasing these statistics publicly and inside the organization, and people are starting to slowly get it. I still have guys that have the warrior mentality. We still have the problem. We had a shooting recently where a guy levels a shotgun at us during a car stop. We exchanged gunfire. We're in the middle of a neighborhood. We fired over 8 rounds before we kill him. It looks horrible on video, but there still is some of that warrior mentality to that. If I'm standing next to a cop and he shoots, even though I really don't have a clear sight picture, I'm going to shoot so nobody thinks that I'm a coward and I didn't fire my gun. We're trying to work to change that, and it's a battle every day to do that.
You said something very important, and I think Scott Thompson did this in Camden too, which is you find the informal leaders who are well respected and you get them to buy in. Traditionally, you think, with what you want to do, you go to your training academy, but that doesn't always work. It's how do you identify the informal network, and why are they so powerful, and how do you get them to see the world the way you do?
What I always looked for were who were the rising stars in the organization? Who are the men and women that are out on the street that do things the right way? When they make an arrest or they get a call, when they respond to a call for service, you never hear their name. You get kudos about them, and they're the ones you try to bring in. And obviously, Chuck, one of the things that I think PERF's great about, I'm not trying to make it a PERF commercial, but you can't train, like in Volusia County, all 12 police departments and the sheriff's office train together every step of the way. Well, you develop groupthink. So you take these informal leaders and you give them the opportunity to go out and see how different police organizations train, to look at a different method to solving a problem, as we learned in Scotland with that critical decision-making model. There's more than one way to solve this problem. And think about this for a minute. Time, distance, and cover. If you take the time and you give yourself distance, you can solve almost any problem. Obviously, that doesn't work for an active shooter, but in a lot of the things that we encounter, if you take a second and get as much information as you can, and then you start to obviously give out awards to these folks, we give out the escalation, the medal, just like I would give out the Medal of Valor, and make it the same, it's on the same plane that, hey, it's just as great to save a life as to stop an active shooter. It's the same principle that we're applying.
That point you just made is so important about giving awards for people who don't use force and save a life, right? I mean, that puts into the DNA culture that variable, because let's face it, in some circumstances, cops would criticize each other for, why didn't you shoot them? You should have shot them. And the cop will feel like you were a coward. You're trying to change it by rewarding people for exercising restraint. And in some of those cases, actually, they're risking their life to save another life, right? That's what sanctity of human life means, right? Everybody says sanctity of human life. What does it really mean? Sanctity of human life means in that circumstance, when you have someone who's suicidal and has a knife, if we do the old training, take out your gun, bark orders, the person comes toward you, he dies. Nobody used to question it. Today, now, that officer, you want him to be safe, but you're rewarding him or her for exercising restraint, and a win-win. Is that what it's all about?
Chuck, that's what it's all about. And even to our SWAT team, the culture with the SWAT team, we equipped them with body cameras, and it was, listen, when you roll out on a call, it's a successful mission if everybody goes home safely. The bad guy went to jail, the community is safe. That's the ultimate goal. Now, sometimes it's not going to happen, but when we roll out on a job, this is what I want you to expect. Same thing with our supervisors and our officers. And you talked about this, Chuck, years and years and years ago. Supervision is so important in this. If we can get a sergeant on scene within minutes, I think it's 50% reduction in use of force. If you get a lieutenant or higher on scene, it's almost a 75% reduction. So it's getting the supervisors that when they hear something to realize, I got to get there just as quickly as my deputies and take charge of this scene.
Okay, Mike, we're going to have to leave it there, so make sure I give Professor Engel enough time. Professor Engel, what do we have you? Is she here? Okay. All right, Robin.
I'm here.
So, I'm not giving you enough time to adequately talk about all the research findings, and use of force. You could probably speak for 2 days, but give us a sense of what you're seeing, some of the more important findings. You've done a tremendous job where you are. You had a very critical incident in Cincinnati that you were thrust in the middle of. You learned a lot of lessons. You really re-engineered that whole department, did a phenomenal job. So now we're talking about use of force nationally, the things you're seeing, and just give us a sense of where the field is now, some of your observations.
Sure. Well, you're right. I'm a professor, so I could talk for hours, so I'll try not to do that for you today. But one of the things that I really want to focus on is that we have this body of best practices. You hear your police executives, the sheriff, talking about some of those best practices. But now it's really time to move those best practices to the next level and make sure that they're evidence-based. So what we're seeing across the country, of course, is a real push towards changing use of force policies and de-escalation training. We're looking at, increased use of body cameras, implicit bias training, early warning systems, citizen overview, all of these things that are designed, we believe, to reduce officer use of force. But honestly, the body of evidence supporting their effectiveness is really pretty thin. And so while they're best practice, they might not be evidence-based. And what I mean by that is, for instance, de-escalation training. We know that this is an important concept. We know anecdotally that it has impact, but what key parts of those de-escalation trainings work? So we know that content of the training matters, the way it's delivered, the dosage, supervisory oversight, and encouragement of using it, managerial oversight, all of those things. What pieces of that really emphasize and make sure that officers are using that de-escalation training? One of our concerns, I believe, is that a lot of the trainings right now are showing changes in attitudes, but not necessarily changes in behavior. So we need to see and better understand how we couple other things, policy, supervision, managerial oversight, with those trainings to make sure that we are changing behavior in significant ways.
Yeah, because people think you just give someone a policy and say, here's what we want you to do. You just give someone training and here's what you want to do. But you've got an organizational culture that has been doing things pretty much the same way for a long time. And you're introducing something that's almost putting these, like the use of force continuum, putting it on its head, say it makes no sense. Because all you would do in use of force continuum is steadily escalate. And you're talking about de-escalation, that, someone does this, you do that, someone, and we're trying to teach cops in some situations the best thing to do is step back and wait, like this isn't working, rather than continuing to use more force. So this is almost bigger than all of us. This is a cultural way of changing people's minds. How do you do that? I mean, is there any insights from the research about, we heard before from Mike Chitwood about informal leaders and so forth. And then, as I say, it was done in Camden. Any thoughts about how policy and culture begin to change?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I've got a couple of examples for you. One of the things that we did at the University of Cincinnati Police Division was we started asking on our stop forms, our pedestrian and traffic stop forms, whether or not de-escalation skills were used and what skills were used. And another agency that I see using this idea is Oklahoma City, for instance. Right now, with their use of force reports, officers are also required to record information about the specific use of de-escalation tactics and what those outcomes were. Now, that type of data collection does two things. One, it allows the agency to look at it systematically and better understand different contexts, different officer characteristics that are leading to the use of de-escalation skills. But it also reinforces for the officer that the managerial oversight really values this, that this is important. And so when you see these things on forms that you're constantly reporting, it becomes more routine and recognized, I believe, in the agency as important, all right? Saving officer lives, saving citizen lives. The other thing I'll tell you, there's a couple of other studies I'll just make note of. There was a recent study that was just published looking at de-escalation training and its impact, and it found, again, changes in officer attitudes, but not necessarily changes in behavior. That was a study done on the T3 training in a couple of different sites. So we need to better understand what the supervisory oversight looked like in those community or in those police agencies. And then one final note for you, a really interesting study just came out done by Greg Ridgway looking at the New York City Police Department. And he looked at situations where there are multiple officers and one officer shoots, but perhaps another one doesn't, and wanted to look and better understand what characteristics predict which officer fires. And he found that when the officer was hired, the age that they came onto the police department mattered, and that officers that were later in their beginning stage of policing, right, that they had started the police department later, were less likely to shoot. Also found that disciplinary matters in the officer's history mattered as well. So these are really interesting new studies that we're taking a look at, but we can't do it without data. So we really encourage police departments to go out there, collect and analyze that data and make it available.
And just to add to that, and then we'll take a few questions here, but that is so important that in the studies that we do on use of force, we look at that. What districts are they occurring? What time are they occurring? You know, what is the age of the individuals involved? And so if you can isolate all of these variables, you can get a better idea. And certainly, early warning systems make a difference. You know, and to date, you know, if you look at the Minneapolis situation, that cop had 17 complaints, and that individual was a field training officer. So what are those cops coming out of the academy supposed to? That's the culture right there. He's the field training officer. He's saying, forget everything you learn in the academy, so you can do everything right in the academy. You got a field training officer who's got 17 complaints. That's a problem. Anyhow, let's open this up to questions. Tom Wilson.
Got a question from Assistant Chief John Oldham in Jacksonville Sheriff's Office for Sheriff Mike Chitwood. How do you reach the middle ground with the union when it comes to trying to find a balance of the guardian versus warrior mindset?
That's a great question. That is a battle that is still taking place today. When you apply to the sheriff's office, you didn't do anything unless you went to the range and fired X number of rounds into a target. And if you pass that particular phase, then you could move forward in the processing. So my thing is, I got to go forward. Again, like I said before, the union has a very great luxury. They only have, in Volusia County, they only have 200 of the 480 deputies. There's only 250 of them there. Me as the leader and the rest of my staff, we have an obligation to the entire community. And when you show evidence-based, because they were screaming this de-escalation is going to get a cop killed, and you show, well, in actuality, nobody got killed. There's less injuries. The statistics are there. You're building credibility in the community that people just turn a deaf ear to the union. But it's a battle. I mean, it's a battle, and I expect it to get worse as the changes come down that we're seeing from the federal government, state government, and from community groups.
Tom, another question.
Several asking, what use of force reforms do you think agencies should prioritize in the current environment?
Robin, I'm going to go to you on that. If you have to give me the top 3 use of force policies that you think would make a difference, any thoughts?
The top use of force policies, why don't we make it broader? I would start with the Community Advisory Council and bring them on board right away, just like the chief in Denver had mentioned. Bring them on board and help them make the decisions about what the priorities should be for police reform. I think that would go a long way. I would also obviously recommend changes to use of force policy. The PERF 30 principles is a great place to start with what the sort of best practices and thinking is for the use of force policy, and absolutely engage in de-escalation training, but make sure you're testing that training. It's so critical and important to make sure that the training is having the impact that we anticipate and expect that it should.
Hey, R.C. White, I want to get you back in the conversation. You characterize yourself as a change agent, but there's a lot of trauma that comes with being a change agent. I mean, you got no confidence votes, you got, the cops don't like them, all of those things. If you had to do it all over again, what advice would you give to future chiefs about the whole notion of change agents? Look what's happened around the country. We're losing chiefs right and left, some of the best. What have you learned about being a change agent?
A couple of things. You have to, and I'm speaking from my mistakes, you got to spend more time with the troops. You absolutely have to be able to articulate what they used to do and what you would like for them to do, and articulate why you want them to do that and give them a voice on it. But the other thing is, I think the key internally are the sergeants. I think in Denver when I was there, we had about 500 or 600 sergeants. I had a conversation with every last one of those sergeants, getting from their perspective, this is why we're going to make those changes, and getting their input. And also having them understand why we're doing that. One of the things that we do in every department that I know of does a phenomenal job is training officers on the legality of the law, the policies and procedures. But we have communities, certainly the communities I've worked in, officers involved in an incident, a controversial incident. I'm not saying right or wrong, controversial. Citizens will come up to me, go to the mayor and says, how come that officer didn't get fired? He didn't violate the policy. How come the officer didn't get indicted by the DA? He operated within the policies and procedures. That officer is breaking the law. This is what citizens are telling us. In their mind, that officer is breaking the law. But what the citizens are really asking is, was the actions necessary? So in my conversation with all of those sergeants, I gave them that as a scenario. Hey, you guys are out there doing what they think is right, doing what they think is legal, but you got citizens, good citizens. Not good, all citizens are good. I'm talking about citizens in the middle of the road that support police, and they're questioning the legality. They think they're questioning the legality of what we're doing, but they're really questioning the necessity of what we're doing. So you got to spend a lot of time with the troops, with the sergeants, and with the community, making sure people understand the difference between legality and necessity. And we, as law enforcement officials, got to raise the bar. It's not just good enough to train people on the legality of the law. You got to train them on the necessity of the law also.
All right, fantastic. We're going to have to thank this panel. We're going to move on. We're right on time. We got 1:30. We're on to the final panel. And let's, as they say, we have a video here, right? Yeah, let's go to this video, and this will help frame the discussion.
Tonight, with a mounting national chorus decrying police brutality against Black Americans, there's a new call for deep structural reform of policing across the country. Many are now demanding departments be defunded, dismantled, or outright abolished.
I want people to understand that we are committed to shifting resources to ensure that the focus is on our young people.
Today in New York, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced a plan to defund the NYPD by shifting money in the city budget from policing to social services. The move joins with Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti, who recently agreed to slash up to $150 million from the police budget. At its core, defunding simply means divesting a chunk from a city's policing budget and rerouting it to community programs. Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza says reinvestment could be a turning point.
But what we do need is increased funding for housing. We need increased funding for education. We need increased funding for the quality of life of communities who are over-policed and over-surveilled.
In Minneapolis, the city council is considering a move to reform the department. At a rally, Mayor Jacob Frey was booed for saying no to dismantling the police department. But policing can be dangerous. Saturday in Santa Cruz, California, a sheriff's deputy was shot and killed during an ambush.
In my 32-year career, this is the worst day that I've ever experienced.
Defunding is a nice catchphrase, but in reality, you're defunding police organizations that, for the most part, are already significantly underfunded. And that's going to be made worse because of the coronavirus economic impact that all states and cities are beginning to feel.
But as the outrage over the death of George Floyd and the plight of millions of Black Americans shifts from protest to change, the calls to defund are only growing louder.
Okay, so our three guests are LAPD Chief Michael Moore, Tempe, Arizona Chief and PERF President Sylvia Moyer, and Professor Barry Friedman at NYU School of Law and the Faculty Director of the Policing Project. So, Michael, how you doing there, sir?
I'm doing great. Big welcome to the group from the West Coast.
$150 million. Okay, let's start out. What's your budget in Los Angeles? What's the LAPD budget?
About $1.85 billion annually for about a workforce of 13,000, 10,000 of those sworn, 3,000 civilians.
So how did we get to this point where the events in Minneapolis and Atlanta translate into funding? How were you thinking about it? And that's a pretty big chunk, $150 million. Now, before you get into it, let me just ask you some questions. What percentage of your budget is personnel?
About 94%. 95%.
So 94% of your budget. So with that 6%, if I'm right, is that training, technical assistance, technology, those kind of things?
Yeah, it's not training. It's going to be the technology. It's the cars. It's the gas. It's the tires. It's what allows us to run this Zoom session. The computers on the desktops. And these are often areas that are deferred and are having to be pushed farther down the line of priorities because our primary mission, we're a people business, and it's people that make that go out and handle calls for service. It's people that go out and do investigations. It's a civilian professional work staff that works our back offices, our forensics, our property rooms, our a number of other records and various responsibilities.
So when you think about this is coming from the mayor, and you're a good, loyal servant. You're not going to criticize your boss. But how do you think about this? How does this translate? Sure. How does this help the city of Los Angeles? In other words, they cut your budget. Do we know where those fundings go? Is someone else going to do what LAPD was doing?
Well, so there's two issues here. One is the aspect of what is our budget, and this year we find ourselves in a time where the organization, the mayor's budget prior to the civil unrest in the midst of this COVID epidemic or pandemic, recognized that it could not sustain its current staffing levels, and so the mayor's proposed budget already included a cut of more than 100 sworn positions. It included a cut of 140 civilian positions and furloughing the remaining amount of civilians, so that we had a shortage of more than 300 full-time equivalents. So it was a downsizing, and it was a making a smaller budget. Now, the numbers did not reflect that because of a collective bargaining agreement that the city entered into with rank and file a year ago prior to this pandemic and current issues of social injustice and how we're going to address that as a society. And because there's raises and compensation, that's what increased our budget. It became a prime target for those that believe the city, county, and this country does not invest the appropriate proportionality of public funding into housing, social services, the mentally ill, those that need jobs. And that is the argument before America today, is that where in the matter of public safety, public health, where do the public monies go? And that these are critics from Black Lives Matter, from others that believe that disproportionately too much of it goes into policing. We know in every city's budget that the majority of the general fund, the unassigned numbers, not funding that is earmarked for housing, not funding that's earmarked for perhaps utilities or other dedicated recs and parks, but just the general fund goes to two primary purposes: and they're both public safety, police and fire. And so you'll hear representations in LA that we're 54% of the general fund. In reality, if you look at the entirety of the LA city budget, which is over 10 billion, we're about 17 to 18%. And we are on par with many other major police agencies across the country. West Coast policing does have a higher salary cost, if you will, than you see in other parts of the country. And that also influences why I believe in many instances West Coast policing has smaller numbers of sworn personnel. It's just how much can the public sector provide for in rank and file and numbers. What this is also, though, is a real issue, is that there is a need for us to continue to invest in communities that are disadvantaged, that historically have seen systematic racism, bias, discrimination. And this is a call that, and particularly in the Black community, that shifting needs to be not just in a formula, but needs to be more deeply ingrained. We saw this lastly in regards to our homelessness, in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen in Los Angeles grow the proportionality of how much public monies are going into programming for people experiencing homelessness. And we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic investing in public health at a rate of millions and millions of dollars that 6 months ago no one would have been able to find. So as a department, we agree that we need to identify alternative ways so that people can be serviced and get needed services and support that are not law enforcement centric. And this conversation is reopening up that conversation that we've had in policing for decades, which is, why does it land on a police or firefighter's doorstep at 3 a.m? Because there's no one else out there. And yet these problems, mental health, homelessness, disputes that are not necessarily law enforcement related, there is no one else to call.
You know, part of the problem, let's say, with the homeless and dealing with those with mental health issues is it almost happens in the course of policing. The police get called because someone's concerned about someone lying in front of their establishment, turns out to be homeless. Is the model that instead of calling the police, you would call some other entity in the city, and so when the citizen sees someone, they wouldn't call 911, they'd call, you know, some other number, and what agency will be prepared? I mean, there's certainly a lot of agencies that deal with the homeless, so it's a good question, but is that going to be something? Sorry.
It's what we're studying now. So the point here is, let's look at the current model and what's happened to the 911 system over the last 20 years. And it has found that everything is not 911. We've come up with 211 for county services, 311 for city services, 911 for emergencies and matters of public safety, and 611 for your cell phone. All right, so we need what we're looking and proposing here in Los Angeles is much of what you see being designed in Sacramento. I talked with Chief Scott in San Francisco and other cities across the country, where you have an alternate service so that when people call 911 today, LAPD answers the line, and what's your emergency? If it's a police emergency, we dispatch. If it's a fire or life emergency, we forward it to the fire department for them to dispatch. And if there's something that doesn't fit either one of those, we currently refer to either 211 or 311. What this program envisions is that there's a book of work that has stayed with LAPD for public safety, and frankly, in public safety, out of 1 million cycles, when policing used to, and perhaps in the past, said we're not going to dispatch for that, this is not a law enforcement problem, and then some unfortunate tragedy happened, we changed our protocols, and then we would start responding to those, and out of 1 million cycles, there may be once or twice that policing actually was needed, but those other cycles were all opportunities for some adverse outcome, or for a public's perception that policing is trying to solve every problem, every societal ill.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Let's go to Chief Moyer in Tempe. Chief, how are you? I'm not getting sound. Hold on. Are you unmuted? I'm not getting sound. Hold on. I'll tell you what, while she's trying to get that sound, let's go to Barry Friedman and let's see if she can fix the sound. We'll come back to you. We're not getting sound. Let's go to Barry Friedman while still tries to get that squared away. All right, Barry, you wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal that just appeared, and you talked about some ways you think this could work. What, you know, you study policing, you have a policing project at NYU. Why do you think this discussion is happening, number one? And number two, where do you see some common ground? And then we'll try to get back to Chief Moyer here.
Sure. Chuck, thanks for having me, and it's good to be here with my friends Mike Moore and Sylvia Moyer. I do think there's room for common ground. I guess I want to say two things. First, if people want to see the Wall Street Journal article, unfortunately it's behind a firewall, but if you will just email us at info@policingproject.org, info@policingproject.org, we will, you can just put just WSJ in the line there, and we'll just shoot it right to you. You know, the world has shifted incredibly quickly in the last few weeks. It's almost been head spinning, and things that I would never have dreamt were going to happen have happened. And I think everybody needs to understand that there's been this kind of a change. And there's a, you know, I was on the phone earlier today with somebody who accused me of being a reformist, as though that was a, you know, denigrating me because that was just wasn't what the world wanted. It wasn't nearly enough. And I think we all need to be conscious of this new reality. The question is where to find common ground, and I, you know, I'm sympathetic to a lot of the things you were just discussing with Mike about budgets. This is all coming at absolutely the worst time. I think what we're seeing is a buildup of a number of factors. First is, you know, a long-standing concern about policing and race. Second, frankly, people that have been bottled up during the pandemic. Third, I suspect some frustration more generally with the political environment in the country, and so a lot of this, you know, has come to your doorsteps, and you should be aware of that, but it is at your doorsteps. The question is, where do we go from here? And we've been approached by folks, you know, across the spectrum, from policing agencies and municipalities to the movement for Black Lives. Everybody, in a sense, scratching their head, wondering what defund means. And in the Wall Street Journal article, I just tried to explain that there's a sense that it means what you and Mike were talking about, which is that folks think there's been a misallocation of funding to social services that people need, and we got to figure out a way to fix that.
But let me kind of push you a little bit, because as I think about what happened in Minneapolis, and I think about what happened in Atlanta, those are cultural issues, those are use of force issues, those are, you know, bad cop issues. So when I hear defunding the police, shouldn't we be investing resources to change that? Because I'm not, and I'm just pushing because I know you can handle this question, I'm not getting the connection between those two incidents and dealing with the homeless or the mental health. That's okay, but don't with 18,000 police departments, with no national standards, with no training, with cultures that vary, with departments that are still doing the same thing they've done for 25 years, doesn't that mean investment, not stepping away?
Yeah, look, it's a great question, and I want to just take it apart. And I don't mind you asking at all. I think it's exactly the right question. So the Wall Street Journal piece, which I want to make sure we get one moment to talk about, because it talks about just a completely different way of thinking about first response that I'd love to share with folks here. And some of you will be hearing from us as we think forward into this idea of defunding and what people mean by it, how to get it on a useful track. There's two halves to the problem. I wrote a long law review article about this, and I say, you know, one sort of harms that the affected communities are focused on are familiar to you. Concerns about stops and searches and frisks and use of force and arrests. But there's this whole other part of the discussion that you may or may not be tuned into, but it is really the one that the sort of policing abolition movement focuses on, which isn't all of that. It's about the denial of social services in affected communities. And the way people see it is your budgets have grown and the things they care about have been cut. And I may yet write an op-ed. I've been talking about this, kind of frustrated with state and local political leadership who are pointing fingers at the police. But where have they also been for the last, 5, 10, 15, 20 years? You weren't cutting all those other budgets, they were. And so, but you need to understand that that's the dissatisfaction, and they don't seem to match up in just the way that you said. But it's this perception that money's going to the police. There are outcomes like in Atlanta and Minneapolis that disturb the communities. and then the communities feel starved for resources. And the question is there a way to meet those needs for social services? And I just want to say this. I think there's a lot of surprising commonality between what most of the people listening think and what folks who are arguing for defunding think, which is that cops say to me all the time, I mean, I quote David Brown in my article, you know, everything in society is being dumped on us. And you all know you're not the right responder for all of this. And so what we really need to do is figure out a way to get to a world in which those needs are being met in another way. And the unfortunate part of it is the numbers that Mike was just talking about, which is municipalities are all hurting financially right now at the very time when they really, to respond to these requests, they need larger budgets.
But you do understand my point about investing in all of the policing is at a crossroads. Do we step back from what they've been doing? I mean, aren't these incidents going to continue unless we fundamentally change? I get the homeless, I get the mentally ill, I get the drugs, I get all of that, I accept that. But there's some fundamental things wrong with American policing that who is going to be the one that's going to help them? And so isn't it an investment? I'll leave it there. Let's take some questions from around the country here. Tom, go ahead.
Question for Chief Moore. Does he have any words of wisdom for constructively engaging with defund the police advocates that he can share?
That's for you, Mike Moore. Mike?
I think, yes, can you hear me? Am I unmuted? Okay, so
yeah,
I think the question was, okay, do I have any advice or counsel for those in addressing the proponents of defund the police? And I think the two things. One is we need to validate the points that have been made here, which is there is an absolute need for resources available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for troubles within our society, that law enforcement is not the best first responder, that the majority of the time it can be those services and support and needs can be met by others, and that historically those needs and met have been left with us as a default because of an unwillingness or an unableness of societal programming to fill the gaps. We've seen this in the success that shift proposes in gang intervention. 30 years ago, 20 years ago, with the formulation of gang interventionists that are community-based, that are trained, that are skilled, and that have the proper disciplines to go in and be violence interrupters and do a much better job than law enforcement does in attempting to establish control or attempting to suppress gang violence. They're able to dissolve it. So there's one aspect which is law enforcement eagerly awaits for the development of those resources. Secondly, to the point that was made that we need funding for training. We need funding to recruit and to hire qualified and capable people who do a very tough and difficult position. And staffing levels have never been recovered. We're still well below our high. And by the way, LAPD has never been overly.
Mike, I gotta interrupt you because I got Chief Moyer back on the line. I want to make sure I give her time. Hey, Chief, can you hear me now?
Absolutely. My line must have melted in the Arizona heat, Chuck.
Okay, well, that happens. Things happen. That's technology. So I say to you, defunding the police, what comes to mind? How are you thinking about this?
Well, first and foremost, I think it means different things to different people. I rely on folks, the real thinkers and researchers in the field like Barry Friedman. I think for most folks, it means something different than the loud screaming of abolish the police, that believe that we have to completely abolish the police because reform cannot occur in policing unless we abolish the profession. I think let's reject that notion. For many others, it is redistribute some of the spending in government, and most in the field that I've spoken with support this examination of how we disaggregate the police functions, how we then reallocate the resolution and the insertion of the right societal actor for the problems that are in every community. And I think that we focus on a couple of things. One is that we accept that we can analyze and reevaluate how we police in society. And as we disaggregate, we identify those things where we are not the appropriate social actor, that we then align funding and we put people in place to perform those functions. But there's a caution there. There are many neighborhoods that we, the police, are the only and the persistent presence to connect folks that are disenfranchised and disconnected and underserved. The police are the only people in that neighborhood to provide them with service. So we've got to be really thoughtful about not rapidly removing the police, but a thoughtful reallocation so that people are not further victimized and disadvantaged. And the second is that we recalibrate the expectations of communities. I'm very concerned about this, that if we reduce funding and appropriately allocate, the over-reliance will still be on the police for the array of social issues for which we are inserted. Third is, as executives, I think we need to push back on the notion and put ourselves in space where we understand what people mean. Because as has been offered, there are people using this as a buzzword or a term. They have no idea what it actually means. That we don't just pick at the edges and go with knee-jerk reactions, but we have a thoughtful examination about what this means. And then I believe we stand firm in the reimagining of police and how we interact with people and within this system, and that we can reform the system without completely dismantling it. So those are some of the thoughts from the perspective that I have.
Isn't the win-win possibility, at least in some of these areas, Chief, a collaboration, right, with mental health providers, with homeless providers? Why couldn't a cop, a mental health provider, respond to a call of someone in crisis? Trust me, there are situations I can think of where I would love a cop to come to a situation and I would hate a cop to come to a situation, and I'd be much happier if they both came, the cop stood back, let the mental health provider talk to the person. That's the win-win. And there's examples of this all across the country. I know, they did this in New Haven with the Yale Child Studies Center, and they've done these kind of things. Isn't that the win-win? Why do we have to say it's this or that? Here's the other thing, and you all said it. 3 o'clock in the morning, some of these places are pretty dangerous. I don't see some of these people just going in there. They would love to have the police with them. Just as sort of a backup and to say it's safe, we need to go in here. I found this out with juvenile probation officers in Chicago. There were places they did not want to go in. But if you teamed them up with Chicago cops, then they could go and they could reach the people. Chief Moyer, isn't that the win-win kind of way of thinking?
So this
See, I got
Michael.
Moore and Moyer, and I'm going to go with Sylvia Moore and Tempe first. Moore, you're second. Go ahead.
So
Sylvia.
I think some would argue that that is an ideal, Chuck, while others would argue that that creates further harms. I don't believe that many of us in this profession would argue that anything we do, or very little that we do, is binary. The clear consideration is an ampersand. It is the and. And so while some argue that that might be an appropriate response, others would say that that is not the appropriate response. I appreciate and value research in these spaces, and Robin Engel can speak to this. I encourage everyone who has not read the work of Barry Friedman to read the work of Barry Friedman. And he makes a lot of very compelling statements and arguments that we should further examine. So I don't know if it's as easy as saying, yes, that's the win-win, yes, that's the ideal, because a lot of folks in policing would argue that that's not the ideal.
Okay, let's go to Chief Moore, and then let's get Barry Friedman the final word, and then I'm going to come back to Chief Moyer again. All right, first, Chief,
let's look at law enforcement.
Mike, you got it.
Let's look at law enforcement for the last 3 decades. It's not binary. We have had the role of policing has been changing and evolving as to this warrior to guardian. The civilization within the police department has that we need to do more civilians. We don't need a law enforcement professional sworn member for every job that law enforcement does. The current debate and current is an opportunity for what do we keep inside of a police department and what do we move outside of it. And I think for Los Angeles, what we're looking at, because we have public health, mental health, social services, is first of all calling this moment out to hold them accountable. Why is it those services, why is it they don't work 24/7? Why are they not available? And so the only person around is the watchman. And that has got to change. Secondly, is we have an opportunity to look at our community-based organizations and ask them. And we do need to hold the public accountable that those organizations can and must step forward. I do think that every time law enforcement looks at this problem, our budgets grow because we add multidisciplinary teams, and it looks like law enforcement is there. And I agree with Sylvia that there's instances in which then the psychologists and LAPD, we have 24/7 SMART teams modeled after the Memphis of the late 80s, and we have 70 officers with 70 clinicians that work on mental health calls. But why don't we have mental health crisis workers first and then call a uniform officer second? And that's what we're looking to promote and achieve.
Okay. And Professor Friedman, and then Sil, you're going to have the last word.
I have four super quick points. First, Sylvia and Mike are extremely wise, and folks should listen. Second, that's info@policingproject.org, and a lot of people are already writing us for it, but we'd love to send you the Wall Street Journal article. Third, the way to think about the world, and I think this is what Sylvia and Mike are saying, is a Venn diagram with two circles that are intersecting. And one part of that diagram is going to be, just the police responding, and another part of that diagram is going to be other social services. And Sylvia's right, in the middle are going to be situations where you need to co-respond because you need the police there, and figuring that out is the task. And finally, no time to discuss this, but I'm going to urge you to try to communicate with and engage the folks who are angry. It is difficult to do. I get screamed at a lot in our work, but sometimes letting them get that off their chest and starting to see common ground is the way to go forward. And we're in a rotten place, but we can get to a better place if we just figure out how to communicate. That's the work that we do at the Policing Project, and I really urge you to try to do that in your communities.
Okay, thank you. And Sil, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, Chuck, this is what PERF does. The Police Executive Research Forum gets folks together. We convene. We bring our perspective. We bring research. We bring experience, successes, failures. This is the texture that makes us different. And as of July, it marks my 10-year anniversary as a chief in California and now here in Arizona. And at no other time have I seen a more demonstrated need for us to collaborate, to share, to bring all of who we are and all of our experience and all the abundant amount of research that is out in the environment to the issues that we face. We are enriched because we are willing to be here together to describe our experiences. And I've said it before, what one person offers may be the spark that creates a change in one police department and then in the profession of policing. I am grateful that folks carved out time to be here, and this PERF staff did the incredibly heavy lift of creating this town hall forum in a virtual format. We are better because we share with each other. And thank you to everyone that's on this call, to the PERF staff and this incredible PERF executive board that somehow finds time to lead their organization through multiple chaotic events and contribute in this way. You're remarkable people, and we are better for your contributions.
And thank you, Chief. Just one little thing, and then we've got we're going to do this again on the 30th. Same kind of thing, 2 hours. We may shorten it, maybe have more. But I want to say something right before I got on here. Steve Anderson from Nashville called me, said he's announcing his retirement. And he's just, he epitomizes the best in policing. He's not going to be leaving for a few months, but they're dropping like flies, everybody. So we're going to have to leave it at that. Thank you all to our great panel. Thank you to our staff. My staff will put this together. There's about 8 people here in Washington. They all have masks except me. So I'm going to put a mask on right away so I can go thank them. Thank you all. You have a great day.